Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's CSAC Research Seminar. My name is Cameron Tracy. I'm a research scholar here at CSAC, and I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sebastien Philippe. Sebastien is a research scholar with Princeton University's program on science and global security, which is part of their School of Public and International Affairs. He's an expert and conducts research on nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, disarmament, and nuclear justice issues. He's most recently a co-author of the book Toxique with French University Press, published in 2021, which looks at the environmental legacy of French nuclear testing in the Pacific. This was, in 2021, a finalist for the Albert Landré Prize, which is the French equivalent of Pulitzer. He has a technical background, a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering, but has been working in nuclear security for quite some time, including as a Stanton Fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, their equivalent of CSAC, and previously worked as a nuclear weapons safety engineer in France's Ministry of Armed Forces. So without further ado, Sebastien, we're happy to hear your talk today.
Thank you so much, Cameron. And what Cameron didn't say is, like, we used to share an office together at Harvard. So it's great to see you again. So happy to be here today. I hope everybody's, yeah, okay. I'm good on the audio. It's particularly important today because I'm going to give a presentation about kind of a major project that was released this past November that I led and worked on for the past 2 years, and many parts of this project are actually multimedia journalism. And so we're gonna use this amazing room sound system, and you're gonna listen to some audio soundtrack. And I hope everything is working and that people on Zoom will be able to hear that also. So this project is about land-based missiles, and in particular, the ones that are based in the United States. So you may know that the US has been deploying nuclear weapons in underground silos since at least since the 1960s. And that at the time when they were first built, between 61 and 66, the US constructed 1,000 silos. Today, 450 remain and are located in 5 states, in North Dakota, Montana, and then 1 missile wings and at the intersection of Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. About 10 years ago, the Air Force decided to replace the existing Minuteman III missiles that are currently in those silos with a new generation called the Sentinel. The Sentinel programs is it's kind of considered one of the biggest military acquisition program right now run by the Air Force. Perhaps one of the biggest in its history. It calls for the makeover of all of those 450 silos, upgrade of command and control infrastructures, as well as development, testing, and deployment of 400 new missiles by 2040. This January, you may have heard in the news that the Air Force told Congress that the program was massively over budget and beyond schedule. So much, in fact, that the Secretary of Defense now has to bail out the program and certify it to Congress and explain why it is necessary for US national security. But we're not going to talk about this today because cost and delays are not the only issues with the program. There are also broader questions about the risk associated with fielding ICBMs and the Sentinel, not only for US national security, the country, but also for communities that live among the silo fields. And this is what this project really focused on for the past 2 years. You may know that one justification offered for the continuous deployment of ICBM is that they raise the cost of conducting a nuclear strike on the US homeland. Essentially, they provide a very large set of targets that would need to be attacked by an adversary nuclear weapons, possibly with several weapons targeting each silo to ensure destruction, raising the scale of any possible attack, and hopefully making it too big for an adversary to even manage or contemplate. This strategy has enormous human and environmental costs associated to it. And this is something that is not new. In fact, something interesting is like it was first studied in the 1970s by two people, Frank von Hippel and Sidney Drill. Sidney was the founding, I think, scientific director here at CSAC, and Frank founded our program at Princeton. So this is the, some of the very beginning of scientist work in the public domain about the consequences and implication of nuclear weapons policies. Despite this being well known for the past 50 years, neither the Air Force or Congress has explained this time around this risk to the country or to the communities that are living near the ICBM silos. And that includes almost 3 years effort that is required under the National Environmental Protection Act by the Air Force to do an environmental impact study of the missile program, of the new missile and also the decommissioning of the current missile. This was a $34 million program to write 3,000 pages of report, and very few people read it. And I can say that I have, and we'll be happy to answer a question about it later. So this project, the missiles on our land, was motivated by this lack of engagement on those issues this time around for this new generation of ICBM. The motivation was to really investigate the human and environmental risks that are associated with the missiles today, but also understand what people living among the silo fields know about ICBMs. If what they know about the risk associated of having ICBMs in their home or near their home, and also how these risks are communicated by the US government to these communities, and particularly by the Air Force. The goal was to provide information, or is to provide information, but the project is published in some sense already, to the public and communities living closest to the field so that they can really understand and be part of the discussion about the future of the ICBM forces, their potential continuous deployment until the 2080s, but also take part in conversation about possible alternative policies. The methodology here is quite unique, and this is something I've worked a lot on for the past 5 years, which is not just work in the academic setting, but to bridge several disciplines in science and social science, and here ethnography, but also work with journalists and investigative journalists from the beginning of the project so that we can explore much broader ranges of sources and information and data that we can generate for the project. So for this in particular, we performed, or actually I performed hundreds of nuclear war simulations to understand what happens when the missile silos are attacked. We reviewed thousands of pages of public Air Force documents. We got more of those documents through the Air Force as well. We conducted dozens of interviews in DC, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, and New Mexico with expert military officials, members of the public, including those living amid the nuclear missile silo fields. All of this was published in November as a website that includes the story explaining the project, 25-minute documentary film, an online platform to explore the data generated in the project, and also a 5-part investigative podcast. This was also published concurrently with a special issue of Scientific American, with whom we collaborated on this for the past year, where half of that issue was essentially focused on the US plan to modernize its nuclear weapons. So after this short, this long introduction, We're going to dive a little bit into two aspects of the project. One is going to be what communities know and what they were told about the project and the modernization program. And the second part will be about the modeling of the nuclear war and how all of its pieces fit together. So what communities know and what they were told. So in this, in our ethnographic and journalism component, I would say, of the project, the starting point this time around was North Dakota. And in particular, the Minot Air Force Base, which is one of the three ICBM silo fields that is currently operational. We also narrowed our focus in one particular communities because it felt to us that that story had actually never been told, and that it was particularly important for plenty of reasons, including for our research team. So it turns out that the first place in the United States where the Air Force presented its environmental impact statements was the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, which is home to the Mandan-Nats and Arikara Nations, federally recognized tribes. And it is the only tribe in the United States that is hosting nuclear weapons on tribal land. And nobody I could speak to first knew about this, and two, could explain how come it had ever happened in the first place. And where we were extremely fortunate for this project, and this is kind of really by chance, was that we had one student in Princeton, Ella Weber, who was an enrolled member of the tribe, and she was the only second member of her tribe to ever attend our university. And she joined our team in the fall of 2022. She already had interest in nuclear policies. She's a major in public policy. And she had done research on the impact of nuclear weapons on indigenous communities, mostly about uranium mining in Navajo. And so when I first met with her and we discussed the project, and I actually brought the news to her in some sense that there are ICBMs on your tribe reservation, essentially. So she tells the story very well in her podcast that I encourage everyone here to listen to, because it is an amazing piece of journalism for someone that is so young and so early in her education. It's also a first piece of journalism, and it's something I think everybody in our community should at least listen to once. So Ella tells the story that as soon as we finished the meeting, she did the first thing she said, as any 19 years old would do, learning that there are nuclear weapons in your backyard, is you call your mom and ask, "Mom, do you know that there are nukes on our res?" That's our words. And the mom said, "Yeah, of course, I know. Yeah, I've known for a long time." And well, you know, she explained, I never know that. I'm kind of amazed. And she said, "Well, why don't you talk to your grandma about it, because she still lives on the reservation." And so Ella started this journey of unpacking how the missiles arrive on the reservation, but also what the tribe is told still by the US Air Force about their role in US national security, and what are the risks associated with having the silos on their land. So when the silo arrives on the reservation in 1962, Deborah tells Ella, Deborah is the grandmother, that she doesn't really remember because she's in boarding school. As it turns out, her home had been flooded by the construction of the Garrison dams, one of the 5 big dams on the Missouri River. And the construction of the dam in the early 1950s had led to the flooding of about all most of the agricultural land on the reservation, and 90% of the tribe had to relocate. And so while all of this was in chaos, all the kids were sent off reservation to boarding school. And people lost their language and their way of life as a result. So 10 years when she came back, around when she was 18 years old. The tribe had been relocating to a part of the reservation that had been opened to outside landowners by the US government in the early 1900s. And when she arrived, the US Army Corps of Engineers, who also had built the dam essentially, had already installed silos on the reservation. And today, Deborah's home is located between silos Hotel 3 and Hotel 6 on this map, which you can't really tell where they are, but I don't know if you see. Let me just show you. She lives right here. So, you know, this was a lot to take in for Ella, also for the rest of the team, as we were trying to understand how this happened for this community. But while, you know, the older generation kind of had that experience, there was also a new generation of tribal members that had grew up after the Cold War had ended. And all of them were very eager, some of them had decided to stay and work on the reservation also. Were eager to reclaim their land, identity, practices, and languages. But nevertheless, they were still impacted by nuclear weapons. And so I'm going to start now playing some part of the podcast so you kind of get a sense of those conversations and you have a chance to listen to the voices of the community.
You know what's crazy? I've always had dreams of explosions going off in the West, and like we'd always be like hunkered down in gymnasiums or like even in like ceremonies. I've had dreams where we're all like in a ceremonial setting waiting for an explosion to go off.
I met Jaylee Fimbres at the recently opened MHA Nation Interpretive Center in Newtown, North Dakota, the most populous town on the Fort Berthold Reservation. While she says she doesn't know much about nuclear weapons, she's been dreaming about nuclear war.
I think I've even, within those dreams, I had dreams of surviving those things as well. But there was like radioactive damage and stuff, and we were like mutating, but we like learned to get through it.
So this was not the only person that, you know, we met on the reservation that kind of had those sentiment of not knowing about nuclear weapons, but experiencing or thinking or even dreaming about them in such vivid ways. And so I wanted to give you this context before starting the kind of next round of tapes that now describes how the Air Force came to the reservation in the summer of 2022 to present the environmental impact statement of the new Sentinel missile. And here's what we found, and what we're going to listen is actual tapes of presentation that they were given to the tribes in that meeting, and also the reaction of people who were there.
The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is a federal law that requires federal agencies to integrate environmental values into their decision-making process. NEPA review is required when a federal action is proposed that may have impacts on the human or natural environment. NEPA includes requirements for involvement of the public and government entities, and in the case of this project, 62 Native American tribes.
Under the National Environmental Policy Act, the U.S. Air Force is required to produce an environmental impact statement. In this case, it is to, quote, analyze the potential effects on the human and natural environments from deployment of the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile system. Also, it is to, quote, provide the public and other stakeholders an opportunity to comment on the action and its associated analyses, and to consider all alternatives. The Fort Berthold Reservation was the first place picked by the Air Force to present this report at a public hearing and collect public comments on the record. This was an opportunity for the Air Force to connect with MHA Nation and to explain the military branch's plans and what they meant for the reservation. Unfortunately, this isn't exactly what happened.
That public hearing, meaningless. You know why it's meaningless? Because nobody was really informed. Nobody was able to give the testimony he wanted to do, and nobody had a clear picture because nobody was prepared. I certainly wasn't prepared.
Logan Davis is a freelance journalist, an Army veteran, and an elder of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa of North Dakota. He's been reporting on the MHA Nation for a long time and happened to be on the reservation that day. He learned about the EIS meeting by chance.
I was eating, talking, visiting, and then I saw this policeman, was a friend of mine. And hey, look, I'm going over to that environmental impact study meetings. What? I'm a journalist. Nobody told me. I didn't know about it until this cop told me. So nobody knew about it, man. So I was calling people, hey, you got to get over here, sir. You got to testify, you know.
Davis's struggle to find where the meeting was taking place was confusing.
Okay, I missed something. So it was so this was the tape of Ella interviewing Logan Davis.
At public hearing,
Who was one of the first, or was the first person to testify that day. And so what he explains to Ella is how he learned about a meeting essentially on a parking lot by accident, by running into a police officer saying, oh, there is a meeting about nuclear missiles, you should come. And what Logan figures out is that there was public notice for a meeting to happen, except it was notified to happen somewhere else. And nobody was aware that a member of the public were not aware that the meetings had changed. And for many of them, even if they had wanted to participate, they were not able to participate. And so that was a big issue for him.
at public hearing,
So what he does, then he goes inside the meeting and he sees that essentially nobody has signed up to give a comment. And so he's the first person to put his name down and explain that it's great that the Air Force was coming in, but there was zero discussion about the potential danger of the weapons and what could happen on the reservation. And something that he explains that is actually amazing, and when you think about how come you have a journalist by accident who is on a parking lot that is learning this, it turned out he had served in Europe in the 1970s with land-based nuclear missiles that were stationed in Germany. And so he had a lot of experience with, more experience with nuclear weapons than most of the members of the tribe that were present that day. And so he gave his public testimony, and he's the first one to do that. And by doing so, he also kind of opens up the space for others. And there are 3 other people that day would testify and would say, this is the first time we hear about this. We're concerned, thank you for coming. But how come didn't you go around and met with the elders in our community? Many of them are not here, can't come to the meeting, and so on. Even a woman that is very close to the Air Force, she's married to an Air Force officer, her daughter is in the Air Force also, explained in her public testimony that essentially there were no real relationship or between the Air Force and the tribe, and that there was not enough information that was even shared, and that most people had no idea what was going on. Beyond the fact that they were told, stay away from those facilities.
at public.
So when we learned that, and Ella learned that, she wanted to know more about who was involved in this process of consultation with the tribe. And so she met the environmental director of the tribe.
To better understand who in the tribal government had been consulted about the environmental impact statement, I met Edmund Baker, environmental director of the reservation, who is responsible for enforcing the 3 affiliated tribes' environmental protection code. You might recognize him from the previous episode. I told him about the EIS hearing.
They said like it was like a town hall community type meeting, but
Really?
yeah.
Well, you understand that the reservation, there's sort of the official release of information, either in a newspaper or maybe on the radio. But even so, I haven't heard the guys in office mentioning anything like this. A little surprised that I don't know what they think of this office. Maybe in the scheme of things with all the projects going on, and this is a busy council, that if you're going to deal with such things as government to government relations and a re-signing or an extension of an agreement to keep nuclear warheads within or near, your tribal nation's homeland, that somehow environmental division might be somewhat relevant.
Edmund wasn't exactly thrilled.
I'm just trying to imagine how they see us. And maybe they see us as this is not important to them. They handle the oil field. Or I don't know what they're thinking actually. But what surprises me most is this has not been an issue.
Given his experiences with environmental impact studies and other permitting issues, I asked Edmund whether it was important for members of the tribe to know what would be the potential nuclear risks associated with living with the silos.
Just technically speaking, if you're going into another person's house, we'll make this candid. Say you come into my house. You want to build something in there. You think it'll be good for me. And you're going to tell me, oh, this is what it does. I'm not going to harm anything. And I ask you, okay, well, what are the risks? And you tell me. At that point, I have the ability, now this is small scale, but these concepts are in there. I had the ability to say, no, that ain't going to fly here. Thank you. We'll have a good time. See you later. No, we're closed. In a lot of sense, that's what the EIS sort of function as, right?
So basically what we learned for the reporting is that many of the people who could have commented on the environmental impact statements and should have been involved in this process were actually not involved in this process. And we broke the news to them that this has happened. And they were members of the government within the tribe. And so after those conversations with the members of the community, with Edmund Baker, we kind of decided to double down and to say, okay, here's, I guess, here's the things that we haven't talked about in those meetings. And so we went forward and with mapping those risks and remapping them with today's kind of technology. So as you can imagine, if you have an attack on US silos or any type of silos or hard targets, that typically would, in this case, generate hundreds of radioactive mushroom clouds that would merge before being dispersed by prevailing winds. And so for this project, we modeled the outcome of nuclear strikes on the silos for every day of the year. So this is data for 2021, but we model that for 5 years using real weather data, real population density map, real building density maps to account for sheltering of the population if they were told to shelter, and compute kind of what would be the impact of those strikes and how many fatalities we would expect. And this is essentially what Sidney Drell and Frank had been doing in the 70s, except instead of doing average winds data, we were using real high temporal frequency and high spatial resolution wind data. So this was published also in this big Scientific American issue. And we find that the fallout would lead to at least over 1 million deaths from acute radiation exposure, possibly way more, up to 5, possibly even more, because we have relatively conservative assumptions. And so we went back to the tribe after this and discussed with Edmund, the environmental director.
I went back to talk with Edmund Baker, environmental director of MHA Nation. We also talked to him in the last episode, where he told me he felt that members of the tribe should be aware of the risks. This time, I visited him with Sebastien Philippe of Princeton University. In case you don't remember, Sebastien is a nuclear scientist and principal investigator of the same missiles research project we talked about in episode 1. He had just finished computing the consequences of a concerted nuclear attack on the ICBM silos. In some sense, he had updated the work that Frank and others had done back in the 1970s and 80s.
Now I'm gonna put the whole image of the entire areas that can be impacted by the fallout, and I can walk you through the color coding. But that's basically the worst case possible for every single person on the map.
Okay. Holy crap. Even Disneyland's not immune. Disney World's out. New York. There's no safe place. So that's, okay, so that batch there in North Dakota, the white sort of a color,
Yeah,
that's 100% fatality.
times
Impact
10.
zone.
Yeah, 10 times what you would need to do, and that's just from the radioactivity.
Okay, so that's not in the EIS, I figure. Or is it?
No.
And when I was saying it's sort of bolstered, downplayed here and there, but they have to mention certain things. Holy cow. Yeah, that's...
So when we published the story, we asked the Air Force for comments, and they said very interesting things. One of them was that they considered that any of those effects or impact of having those missiles was beyond the scope of the environmental impact statement. In their own word, this had been the biggest environmental impact statement in the history of the National Environmental Protection Act. $30 to $40 million for years. A ton of people work on this. And what this thing can really do, or how it can be used or used against, was not described at all. The EIS considered that no nuclear materials were involved in this new missile system. And so there were no radiological analysis associated with this in thousands of pages of documents, which as a former as a former nuclear safety engineer kind of blew my mind the first time I saw this. Even the mundane kind of nuclear accidents that DOE will cover and model in its EIS when it's making new plutonium pits and everything, none of this was in there. Absolutely amazing. So now you can explore the project data. And so what we did, we took all this nuclear war data, put it together on the website, broke it down by zip code, and highlighting the 7 communities where the Air Force went to present the EIS, what would be the impact for them, how many people attended the meeting, the number of comments that were given and what type of comments were given, what was most important for those communities. We also highlighted the 62 tribes that the Air Force said they engaged with for this process under the National Historical Preservation Act and HPA. So those two legislation, and HPA and NEPA, are kind of the big difference from building the silos 60 years ago to redoing them today, is that you do have to consult the public on those issues. And on the Historical Preservation Act, we also have on the record the tribal historical preservation officer who was mentioned in the draft EIS report as being the point contact, saying he had never been contacted. Only 2 tribes out of the 62 actually signed that programmatic agreement of the Sentinel program. We don't really know what's the status for all the other tribes. This project, was released, and we're very happy to know that it's also being recognized. So last week we learned that we're shortlisted for an award for best data journalism in the world. So we're very proud of this and the work we've been doing on this. Now I'll just conclude a little bit and present you the next steps for this. And I would love your feedback now, because I think this is something that we're not stopping. It's not like a fire and forget type of project. This is something where there are follow-ons and there are questions about where do you go next. So concluding remark, and I think we're in the Bill Perry's room, so I feel very safe to ask the questions. Are CBMs a risk we can continue to afford? I think this project for me kind of validated, of course, what was known already, but broadened it in a way that I was not expecting in terms of the potential impact of strikes on those silos, especially given that the silos are, essentially redundant, somewhat a redundant leg of the nuclear triad, and that this could be avoided by thinking about how to structure US nuclear forces differently. We've learned that those living among the ICBM silo fields sometimes know a lot about nuclear weapons, but what's very clear is they haven't been properly informed or either consulted about the biggest nuclear modernization program that is happening right now in this country, which is astonishing. There were 7 in-person meetings, 300 people attended. It sounds like a lot, but it's not. In some meetings, like in Minot, there was a meeting in Minot, 5 people showed up, 0 comments. There's a couple of places like this, 1 comment. In total, there were 22 public comments on the biggest EIS of the history of NEPA. I'm just repeating because just so that it's thinking. My wife, when I explained her that story, she said, we get more comments at our public school board meeting on Tuesday night, where parents are tied up with their kids and whatnot. And it's certainly, we're not talking about the same amount of money here. And the other thing that we learn and what we want to know more about is that that's, it's kind of like early results, but that communities really want to know about alternatives. They don't see themselves at all as being part of national sacrifice zones. And even if this were to continue moving forward the way it is right now, it's clear that there is a demand for transparency and accountability in addressing the impact of those weapon systems on those communities. And most people do have a strong interest in understanding policy trade-offs. So as next step, we want to broaden the geographic scope of this project. Right now the focus was really North Dakota, although we also had reporting in all the states that host ICBMs. So this is helpful because we've been able to identify people, but also specific communities and their concern. And in some sense, the EIS process there worked to some extent because all those public comments are available and you can read them. We want to better understand the economics of the Sentinel program. I mentioned the cost have been blowing up. It's now almost past 70% more than originally budgeted. It has triggered a congressional review. There's not really a good understanding of the current cost projections, but also how those costs trickles down, how the structure of trickle-down economics essentially is built in the program, and to what extent community housing the silos actually do benefit from them. And here there's a clear example that is very interesting in Nebraska, where the reconstruction of the silos is calling for the construction of workers' camps to house thousands of temporary workers for a few years in each of those silo fields, where the local communities are asked to pay local taxes and state taxes to build infrastructures to support the temporary worker for this federal program. And there's pushback on this because why? Why do we pay for something we're supposed to benefit from? So really unclear, and I would love, if anyone has insight on this, how to look this and try to map out those numbers. And finally, I mean, the tools that we built, I passed on very quickly about this, modeling of nuclear war. This was like years of computer time, terabytes of data, really insane scale up of everything we were able to do before, because we were modeling hundreds of nuclear explosions at the same time on a very large grid at a like half-a-mile resolution. And so all those tools essentially can now be used to explore other scenarios of nuclear weapon use, better understand the implication of different nuclear force structures or targeting policies in this country and elsewhere. So I will stop here. This was a huge project. It takes an entire village, and there's members of the village. We were 12 at least to work on this, almost full time for a year, and almost more than 20 people, at peak time to deliver the entire package. So I'm happy to take your questions now.
Thanks, Dr. Philippe, for a presentation that's both insightful and sobering. We have about 15 minutes, so if you want to come to the front, we can move to Q&A. As per the CSAC tradition, we'll start with questions from our fellows. After that, I'll move on to the rest of the room and online. If you're in the room, the normal tradition is raise one finger to get on a list I'll be keeping, 2 fingers if you want to interject into a currently going on topic. Also, when you get the mic, please make sure that it's on. The green light should light up, and take a second to introduce yourself, especially for our online viewers who won't be able to see who is asking the question. For those of you online, there are about 40 in that space as well. If you have a question, please feel free to enter that into the Q&A function on Zoom. Some of you have already started, and I'll sprinkle those in as well. So first, let's start with fellows. I saw first Johanna.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Johanna Ruda-Hanok. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows here. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think this is an absolutely awesome project. And I clicked around the website a little bit before, and I just wanted to say massive respect for this project. I think it's really cool and really important and urgent. I had 3 questions, and I'm going to be quick, but if they're answered, within the podcast or like other parts of the project, feel free to just point me to that. That's absolutely fine. First question, I was interested in if you have looked into what the basis is on which, on which essentially the missiles in the MHA nation case have been put onto tribal land. So I understand that it's a different thing on like federal land, but what is the like contractual or legal basis to put them there? Is this like an eminent domain kind of thing, or I was just wondering if that's something that or if it's just kind of like expropriation essentially. Second question was, are you suggesting that the EIS meeting in the MHA nation case again was intentionally obfuscated, which I think would be sort of like a broader pattern, right? As the Trinity test downwinners also haven't been informed about that sort of thing. And if you're suggesting that, why so? Like, do you think there's a intentionality behind not putting certain informations out there? And then the third question was about what actually was, you hinted at that you might be able or happy to talk about this in the Q&A. What actually was in the EIS report? Was this just regarding the potential effects of nuclear accidents, or because you mentioned, all these downwind effects weren't actually were branded beyond the scope. So I was wondering what actually was the focus of the report. Thank you.
Those are 3 great questions. So to your question 1 is it's episode 2 of the podcast. It kind of dives into all of this. And it's a mix of all the things you mentioned. The government built the silos in places where they feel that the tribe, well, they had opened up part of the tribal land to outside landowner and felt that they could do whatever they wanted. And then after the silos were built, there was a court case that reinstated and reaffirmed the tribe ownership of this part of their reservation. And so then they inherited the silos, but never agreed to them in the first place. Obfuscation, I don't, I'm online on the record and not going to comment on this. Question 3, nuclear accidents are not part of the EIS this time. And it's kind of really mind-blowing. And I've been trying to understand this. And I think it's linked to also a legal kind of court case where there was a previous EIS. This was, I think, the Bangor Naval Base. So considering SLBM's accidents, where there was an NRDC, I think NRDC was part of it, challenge that this analysis had not been properly done. And somehow there was a ruling that no, the DoD doesn't have to do those analyses. And so I don't know. But the bottom line is like there's one sentence in 3,000 pages that says, there's nothing radiological. So it's all about construction of new easements, roads, communication towers, connections, all the things that, yeah. I mean, there are a few things that are very interesting. I mean, anyway, I can talk more about this afterwards. There are some very important information here and there that also give kind of a window into the program and its future that nobody really has kind of discussed so far. That I'll be happy to discuss. Yeah.
Lindsay.
Hey, I'm Lindsay. I'm a postdoc here. I have a lot of questions for you about the model, but I can ask that later. Something I've always been curious about with the North Dakota one particularly, and I think you show it really well, is like, have you guys engaged with any Canadians on this? Because, I mean, it just seems like so much of the effects are actually going to be imparted on Canada. And so there might also be, because with radiation and health physics, there is some requirement to contain risk as much as you can across sovereign borders. So maybe that would be like an interesting approach.
It's a good question. Yes. And the answer is, it's very interesting because it's the one place where there was no follow-on coverage in the press. We wrote, well, when all of this was pushed out, well, it's true and not true because Scientific American is also available in Canada. So, we pushed out something that is printed hundreds of thousands, in print and millions of readers online. But there was no follow-on coverage there, to my surprise. It was covered in many places around the world and in the country, but not in Canada. And that was kind of the first thing I saw on this map, I must say. And I kind of like, so when I crunched this for the first time, I had all this data on the computer. I tried to compile that map. At first, it compiled overnight, over the weekend, actually. So on Monday morning, I arrived in the office and was like, well, it most likely has crashed. But to my surprise, it was there. And I was shocked by, how symmetrical this is. So this is the worst case possible for, this is not like what happens with one attack. This is like the worst case possible for all the wind patterns. So it gives you a sense of the extent of very high levels of radiation all across North America, where they can go, where the fallouts can go. Yeah, and it's, there's no border here. It's like very symmetrical, and it's perfectly aligned with our understanding of, the high altitude winds and their speed and how they wiggle around. And, yeah.
Sure, and then we'll come back to Scott on this side.
Hi, Josh Glonick, a visiting scholar and a member of the U.S. military, thankfully not the Air Force for today's purpose. Two quick questions. Can you just sort of briefly describe the scenario that would lead to the fallout that you've modeled? Is it an enemy attack against all silos? Does it take into account enemy capabilities or doctrine? And does it take into account sort of missile defense? What would, probabilistically, what would occur? And then the second piece is, what sort of triggered this project, it sounded like, was the upgrade from the Minutemen to the new system. And where I was thinking I was going to hear was more about specific differences and risks associated between those two systems. So was there anything that you looked at or in that environmental survey that discussed whether there'd be increased risk of accidents or other sorts of things related to upgrading the system? Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. Even if you were a member of the Air Force, there's nothing personal here. I just want to say this, there's nothing personal. I think, it's important even for the Air Force that they actually, even if you were to, that they should do this properly or more properly in some sense. The opportunity is here, definitely, to improve. So on Q1, it's, the scenarios here. So there are many ways you can think about this. One is just to say, which was the way we took, was, that idea that the silos are, one of their strategic justification is that they're there to absorb a nuclear attack that is actually meant to be targeted, so that any attack would be massive. So we're talking about a massive strategic attack on the United States. So if you were to run this, and I can run this, and I might do it in the future, I'm not saying right now, but you would also, target all kinds of places, not just the silos. You may target the silos. The Russians are the only one who can do that right now. I had a very conservative assumption. Well, conservative. I just assumed like one warhead on each silo, not even like 2 or 3. I didn't do, probability calculation of how high, how likely they would be able to destroy each of them. I just say, okay, if you blow up just one warhead on each silos, how does it look like? But one thing I've learned, and that was kind of really interesting, is a lot of the people who would die there would actually not die if you had a major attack on everything else, because a lot of the targets are on the East Coast. Most of the targeting for all the other targets are likely not to be, a lot of them are not ground burst. So because you have, or very low air burst or ground burst that are required to destroy hard target ICBMs, you would not have a concentration of fission products so big anywhere in the country. So this is kind of like the biggest radiological impact of an attack on the country. What would be most at risk? You can also compute all the land that would be contaminated and where you would not be able to use for years and whatnot. In terms of probability, I don't know what's the probability of nuclear war. I think it's kind of hard to, guess that. I've never really been, gone in that route. I know many have done this, that there's been a recent study. The one thing though, on your question too, and I think it's a really good one, and that's one piece of information that I found interesting in the EIS, is the EIS explained that the new missile is going to be bigger. So everything else that I read before, everything else that everybody was saying, is that this is actually a one-on-one replacement. We're essentially replacing a missile with the exact same missile, except the technology is slightly newer, or sorry, I'm using my English. Technology is more up to date, flexible and whatnot. But the EIS actually said that the mass of the missile is 30 to 40% more. So it's significantly bigger missile, most likely to carry a bigger payload. So either the same number of warheads, but bigger warheads, or perhaps even more warheads in the future. And as a good nuclear safety weapon system engineer, I would assume that there is a completely brand new safety analysis that needs to be done about all the systems, because you're going to need new equipment, It's going to be a bigger missile and the same type of tubes. All kinds of things are changing. But that doesn't transpire in that EIS. None of this is in there. So I would assume that for those who can have the opportunity to learn more about this, that I hope that this is going on. But a bigger missile mass, means more potential for a bigger, at least, explosion of the fuel and potential spreading out of the plutoniums in the warheads or on top of the warheads. I mean, there are all kinds of accidents that you can think about, but none of those, again, are also included in that report.
We have just a few minutes left. We had a two-finger from Marty, then we'll move on to Scott. And if there's time, I'll get a couple quick questions.
On the
from online.
probability of a major nuclear war, while there's debate about this, I did published a paper 2.5 years ago. Bill Perry told me he agreed with it and gave me permission to quote him, that estimated, you can only do it very approximately. You can't do it exactly, obviously, but to an order of magnitude, as we say in engineering, which just means within a factor of 10, it was roughly 1% a year, which corresponds to playing Russian roulette 5 times over the life of a child born today. So there's a much greater risk than people realize.
Pass it across to Scott.
Scott Sagan, the co-director here. I thought this was really pretty stunning, and I wanted to make a point about the two things that I found were most surprising are two things that you didn't emphasize very much. One, the Arikara actually were the tribe that sided with George Custer and fought with 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So they have a history, and I think most tribes in the United States have a history of a larger, disproportionate number of soldiers fighting for the US military. And it would be interesting. I was surprised, therefore, with the comment about they didn't sign up to be a national sacrifice zone, because I think Native Americans actually have enormous sacrifices for the US military. And it'd be very interesting to look at that aspect of this, and why does the tribal government have a different assessment than you have in sort of just the statistics about who volunteers. The second thing I was really surprised is the failure to look at accidents here. To me, it's not surprising that environmental impacts did not include what happens if an adversary drops a nuclear weapon on you. Because if that was the case, every truck factory, every new airport being built in the United States would have to have that included in their environmental impact statement. And I don't think the law requires them, and I can understand why it doesn't. But if you have a history of accidents, like the Beaumark accident, or the Damascus accident, that's really outrageous that they don't take that into account. So I just encourage you to, were you as surprised at that as I was? And how is the Air Force responding? Because that seems to me to be a clear failure of responsibility.
On that second one, I was absolutely mind blown. Yes. Also because I spent a lot of time doing that. And I don't understand. I wrote about it in the print piece for Scientific American. I kind of had limited, you always had limited real estate, but I did kind of tackle it. And yeah, I cannot explain it. I cannot explain it. And as I mentioned, the only thing I found was this case that the court essentially dismissed the fact that they had to do it. And I don't know. So I think this is something that needs to be, digged up even more. It's very surprising to me. Because then, it means that essentially there is no discussion about, well, there's some mentions of, areas where you're not supposed to build around the silos. But for what I gathered, it's not really super well respected right now. One thing I haven't shown you today is North Dakota is also, the home of oil and gas fracking. And there are thousands or hundreds of oil rigs across the silo field. some of them are really, really close. And in fact, we have this amazing picture. Nina Berman, we took all the amazing pictures, professor at Columbia, and she directed the photojournalism program. She had this picture of the oil rig, right next to the silo, pumping gas, and this is going everywhere. I don't even know if people really kind of tracked things how they were supposed to be tracked this past 10 years or so with the oil boom. So I am concerned with some of the issues. Yeah.
Well, and did you compare these to environmental statements that would have been done in the MX missile basing studies? Because those had included mobile options, which would create less vulnerability of the missiles, but expose the risk of accident more highly.
It's a good question. I haven't looked at the EMX one. I should. Yeah, it's a very good point. The ones I'm also familiar with are the DOE environmental impact statements for plutonium pit productions, and where they do, model the outcome of major fires after major breach of containments and whatnot, and you have this and then you have nothing. And I really can't explain it very well. Yeah.
We are at time or slightly over, so my apologies to those of you who have questions we couldn't get to, but the URL, the website for this that Dr. Philippe mentioned earlier, missilesonourland.org, would be a great place to learn more information. Thank you again for letting us hear about your research.
Thank you.